Landlord's scheme exposed. After exploiting Tenant, Judge Caprio's unstoppable court decision. The early morning light filtered through the grimy windows of the Providence Municipal Court, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches. Outside, the October wind carried the salt-tinged air from Narragansett Bay, a reminder that winter was approaching fast in Rhode Island. For Sarah Martinez, a 34-year-old single mother of two, this courthouse represented her last hope, a final stand against a system that seemed designed to crush people like her. Sarah sat in the back row, her weathered hands clutching a manila, folder filled with photographs, receipts, and handwritten notes. Her dark hair was pulled back into a simple ponytail, and she wore her only decent outfit, a navy blue dress she'd bought from a thrift store 3 years ago for her son's school graduation. The fabric had faded, but she'd pressed it carefully the night before, wanting to look respectable for what might be the most important day of her life. The courtroom buzzed with the familiar sounds of morning proceedings. Attorneys shuffled papers, court clerks prepared files, and other defendants waited nervously for their cases to be called. But Sarah's attention was focused on the empty judge's bench, knowing that soon Judge Frank Caprio would take his seat, the man whose reputation for compassion had given her the courage to fight back. Her story began 18 months earlier, when she'd answered an advertisement for a 2-bedroom apartment on Federal Hill, Providence's historic Italian-American neighborhood. The rent was $1,200 a month, steep for her salary as a nursing assistant at Rhode Island Hospital, but manageable with careful budgeting. The landlord, Marcus Delacroix, was a smooth-talking man in his 50s who owned a small real estate company called Harbor Properties LLC. He'd presented himself as understanding and flexible, especially when Sarah mentioned she was raising 2 children alone. What Sarah didn't know was that Delacroix had perfected a predatory scheme over the past decade, targeting vulnerable tenants, single mothers, elderly residents on fixed incomes, and immigrants who might not fully understand their rights. His method was insidious in its simplicity. He would rent properties at seemingly reasonable rates, then systematically create conditions that would force tenants to pay additional fees, or, better yet, abandon their leases so he could re-rent at higher prices to new victims. The apartment Sarah rented was a perfect example of his tactics. Located in a converted Victorian house, it appeared charming from the outside, with its weathered shingles and small front garden. But Delacroix had deliberately neglected crucial maintenance issues. The heating system was ancient and inefficient. The plumbing was prone to backups, and the electrical wiring was dangerously outdated. He knew these problems would surface, and he had his responses prepared. During Sarah's first winter in the apartment, the heating bills skyrocketed. The old radiator system, which Delacroix claimed was vintage charm, was actually an energy-guzzling monster that barely heated the rooms above 50 degrees. When Sarah's electricity bill reached $400 in January, nearly a third of her monthly income, she called Delacroix to discuss the issue. His response was sympathetic but firm. The lease clearly stated that tenants were responsible for all utilities, and he'd be happy to install space heaters for an additional monthly fee of $150. This was the first trap. Sarah, desperate to keep her children warm during the brutal New England winter, agreed to the arrangement. She didn't realize that Delacroix's space heaters were cheap, inefficient units that would drive her electricity costs even higher while creating a fire hazard. The additional monthly fee went directly into his pocket while Sarah struggled to keep up with the mounting expenses. The plumbing problems began in spring. The upstairs bathroom would back up regularly, flooding the floor and creating unsanitary conditions. When Sarah called for repairs, Delacroix's response followed his established pattern. He would send his brother-in-law, Tony, who charged premium rates for substandard work. Tony would make temporary fixes that lasted just long enough for Delacroix. to claim the problem was solved, then inevitably break down again within weeks. Each repair call cost Sarah between $150 and $300, money she couldn't afford but had to pay to maintain basic living conditions for her family. Delacroix always presented these charges as reasonable and necessary, often saying things like, "You know, Sarah, I'm trying to help you out here. Other landlords would charge twice as much." His tone was always concerned and paternal, making Sarah feel grateful rather than exploited. The electrical issues were the most dangerous part of his scheme. The old fuse box would trip regularly, leaving Sarah and her children without power for hours or sometimes days. Delacroix would respond to these emergencies by sending Tony to install temporary solutions, extension cords running through walls, outlet multipliers that overloaded circuits, and jury-rigged connections that violated every safety code in the book. Each fix cost Sarah money while making the building more dangerous. By the summer of her first year, Sarah was paying nearly $2,000 a month between rent, utilities, and constant repair fees, 67% more than her original budget. She was working extra shifts at the hospital, taking on weekend work, and had even started cleaning offices at night to make ends meet. Her children, Miguel, 12, and Isabella, 8, rarely saw their mother awake anymore. She would leave before they woke up and return after they'd gone to bed, exhausted and stressed. The breaking point came during her second winter. The heating system finally died completely during a February blizzard that dropped 18 inches of snow on Providence. The temperature in the apartment dropped to 40 degrees, and Sarah's children developed respiratory infections from the cold and dampness. When she called Delacroix in panic, his response revealed the true nature of his character. Instead of emergency repairs, Delacroix offered Sarah a choice. She could pay $2,000 up front for a new heating system installation, or she could accept his generous offer to break the lease without penalty and help her find more suitable accommodations. He presented this as doing her a favor, suggesting that the apartment was maybe too much for someone in your situation, and that he was trying to look out for your family's best interests. Sarah realized she was trapped. She couldn't afford the $2,000 repair cost, but she also couldn't afford to move between security deposits, moving expenses, and the difficulty of finding affordable housing in Providence's tight rental market. Breaking the lease would likely leave her family homeless. She had no savings left after 18 months of Delacroix's exploitation, and her credit had been damaged by the constant financial strain. That's when Sarah discovered she wasn't alone. Through a tenants' rights group at her church, she met other victims of Delacroix's schemes. There was Mrs. Chen, an elderly Chinese immigrant who had been charged $500 a month in maintenance fees for a studio apartment that had no maintenance issues. There was James Wilson, a disabled veteran who had been forced to pay for accessibility modifications that were actually required by law. And there was the Rodriguez family, who had been evicted after refusing to pay for emergency repairs that were caused by Delacroix's deliberate neglect. The pattern became clear. Delacroix specifically targeted vulnerable populations who were less likely to understand their rights or have the resources to fight back. He used their desperation against them, presenting exploitation as assistance and profiting from their struggles. His properties generated nearly 200% more income than comparable rentals through this systematic abuse. Armed with this knowledge and encouraged by the tenants' rights group, Sarah made the decision to fight back. She began documenting everything, photographing the dangerous electrical work, recording conversations with Delacroix, and researching Rhode Island tenant law at the public library. She discovered that many of Delacroix's practices violated state housing codes, consumer protection laws, and basic tenant rights. The process of preparing her case became Sarah's obsession. She would spend her few free hours researching legal precedents, organizing evidence, and reaching out to other victims. She learned that Delacroix had been operating his scheme for over a decade, generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal profits while putting families at risk. Yet he'd never been held accountable because his victims were typically too overwhelmed, uninformed, or financially desperate to challenge him. Now, sitting in Judge Caprio's courtroom on this crisp October morning, Sarah felt the weight of not just her own case, but the hopes of every tenant who had been victimized by Delacroix's predatory practices. She had spent her last $200 on filing fees, but she was determined to expose the truth and seek justice not just for her family, but for everyone who had been exploited by this cruel system. As the clock approached 9 a.m. and the bailiff prepared to announce Judge Caprio's entrance, Sarah took a deep breath and whispered a prayer. She didn't know that across the courtroom, Marcus Delacroix sat with his expensive attorney, confident that his wealth and legal team would easily overwhelm a struggling single mother. He had no idea that Judge Frank Caprio was about to uncover the full scope of his predatory empire, setting in motion events that would change not just Sarah's life, but the lives of countless other vulnerable tenants throughout Rhode Island. Marcus Delacroix adjusted his silk tie and checked his Rolex as he sat in the front row of Judge Caprio's courtroom, every inch the successful businessman. At 54, he had cultivated an image of prosperity and respectability that masked the predatory nature of his real estate empire. His tailored charcoal suit was perfectly pressed, his graying hair meticulously styled, and his Italian leather shoes gleamed under the courtroom's fluorescent lights. To most observers, he appeared to be exactly what he claimed to be: a successful property manager dealing with an unfortunate tenant dispute. Beside him sat his attorney, Richard Blackwood, a partner at Blackwood and Associates, one of Providence's most prestigious law firms. Blackwood was known for his aggressive tactics and his ability to intimidate opposing parties, particularly those who couldn't afford high-quality legal representation. His briefcase contained a thick file designed to overwhelm Judge Caprio with technical legal arguments, hoping to bury Sarah Martinez's claims in an avalanche of procedural objections and contract technicalities. What neither man realized was that Judge Frank Caprio had already begun his own investigation into Harbor Properties, LLC. The night before, after reviewing Sarah's initial filing, something had troubled the judge deeply. Over his decades on the bench, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to recognize patterns of abuse, and Sarah's case had triggered every one of his internal warning systems. Judge Caprio had spent the evening in his home office, surrounded by law books and case files, but also by family photographs that reminded him why he had dedicated his life to serving justice. On his desk sat a picture of his grandchildren playing in the snow, their faces glowing with innocence and joy. It was images like these that drove his passion for protecting the vulnerable from those who would exploit them. Using his connections in the housing department and municipal records office, Judge Caprio had uncovered a disturbing pattern. Over the past 10 years, Harbor Properties LLC had been involved in over 200 tenant disputes, evictions, and code violations, an astronomically high number for a company managing only 35 properties. Even more troubling, the company had generated nearly $400,000 in what were classified as additional fees and emergency repairs during that same period. The judge had also discovered that Delacroix's business model relied heavily on targeting specific demographics. An analysis of his tenant records revealed that 78% of his renters were single mothers, elderly individuals on fixed incomes, recent immigrants, or people with limited English proficiency. These weren't coincidences, they were carefully calculated, targeting strategies designed to identify victims who would be least likely to understand their rights or have resources to fight back. But the most damning evidence came from building inspection records. Judge Caprio's research revealed that many of the emergency repairs that tenants had been forced to pay for were actually correction of code violations that were Delacroix's responsibility as a landlord. The heating system failures, electrical problems, and plumbing issues that had cost Sarah thousands of dollars were not random breakdowns. They were the predictable results of Delacroix's systematic neglect of basic maintenance and safety requirements. As Judge Caprio had reviewed these records, his legendary compassion had transformed into righteous anger. This wasn't just a civil dispute between a landlord and tenant. This was systematic exploitation of some of society's most vulnerable members. Families like Sarah's were being pushed to the brink of homelessness, not by circumstances beyond anyone's control, but by the deliberate greed of a man who had turned human desperation into a business model. Now, as the morning session began, Delacroix presented his case with the smooth confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences for his actions. When called to the stand, he spoke in measured tones about the challenges of property management, the unreasonable demands of difficult tenants, and his company's commitment to maintaining safe, affordable housing in Providence. His narrative painted Sarah as an unfortunate example of financial irresponsibility. According to Delacroix, she had agreed to all additional charges voluntarily, had been warned about the property's age and potential maintenance issues, and had consistently failed to follow proper procedures for reporting problems. He presented himself as a patient, understanding landlord who had gone above and beyond to accommodate a struggling tenant, only to be rewarded with frivolous legal complaints. Blackwood supported this narrative with a presentation designed to overwhelm rather than illuminate. He cited dozens of contract clauses, referenced obscure housing regulations, and presented a timeline of events that made Sarah appear demanding and unreasonable. Their strategy was clear: bury the real issues in technical complexity while portraying Delacroix as a victim of an ungrateful tenant's unrealistic expectations. But Judge Caprio was not easily fooled. As Delacroix testified, the judge's keen eyes noticed subtle details that revealed the man's true character. There was the way Delacroix's expression hardened when he thought no one was watching, the calculation behind his practiced sympathy, and the slight contempt in his voice when referring to tenants as "these people" who don't understand the realities of property management. More importantly, Judge Caprio began asking questions that Delacroix and his attorney hadn't anticipated. Rather than getting lost in contract technicalities, the judge focused on basic facts. Why had heating repairs cost $150 per month when a proper system replacement would have cost only $2,000 total? Why had electrical emergencies occurred so frequently in buildings that had supposedly passed safety inspections? Why did harbor properties have 10 times the industry average for tenant disputes? Each question revealed another layer of Delacroix's scheme. The monthly heating fees weren't for equipment rental, they were pure profit extracted from tenants who had no choice but to pay or freeze. The frequent electrical failures weren't due to aging systems, they were the result of deliberately deferred maintenance that created recurring revenue streams through emergency repair calls. The pattern of tenant disputes wasn't due to unreasonable renters. It was the inevitable result of a business model based on exploitation. As Delacroix's testimony continued, Judge Caprio's questions became more pointed. He asked about specific code violations, demanded explanations for repair costs that exceeded market rates by 300%, and inquired about the tenant demographics that seemed to suffer disproportionately under harbor properties management. With each question, Delacroix's composure slipped slightly, his polished facade cracking under the pressure of unwavering judicial scrutiny. The turning point came when Judge Caprio asked about Mrs. Chen, the elderly immigrant who had been charged $500 monthly in maintenance fees for a studio apartment. Delacroix claimed he didn't recall the specific case, but the judge produced records showing that Mrs. Chen had paid over $6,000 in maintenance fees for an apartment that had received less than $500 in actual maintenance during her entire tenancy. Blackwood objected that Mrs. Chen's case was irrelevant to Sarah's situation, but Judge Caprio overruled him with a gentle but firm explanation. Counselor, when we're examining patterns of conduct, similar cases become very relevant indeed. I'm trying to understand whether Ms. Martinez's experience represents an isolated misunderstanding or something more systematic. The word systematic hung in the air like a thunderclap. Delacroix and Blackwood exchanged worried glances as they realized that Judge Caprio wasn't just reviewing a simple landlord-tenant dispute. He was conducting a comprehensive investigation into Harbor Properties' entire business model. As the morning session continued, Judge Caprio's questions revealed the sophisticated nature of Delacroix's exploitation. The judge had identified what prosecutors would later call poverty profiteering, a business strategy that deliberately targeted people's financial desperation to generate excessive profits. Delacroix didn't just rent apartments. He created financial traps that extracted maximum revenue from tenants who had no realistic alternatives. The scheme worked because it exploited multiple vulnerabilities simultaneously. Delacroix targeted people who couldn't afford security deposits for better apartments, then subjected them to conditions that made saving money impossible. He created emergencies that required immediate payment, knowing that his tenants couldn't afford to move or seek legal counsel, and he maintained a veneer of helpfulness and concern that made victims feel grateful rather than exploited. But perhaps most insidiously, Delacroix had structured his business to make each individual case seem isolated and minor. A single mother paying an extra $150 for heating doesn't sound like a major crime. An elderly immigrant being charged $500 for maintenance might seem like an unfortunate misunderstanding. But when Judge Caprio began connecting these individual cases into a broader pattern, the true scope of the exploitation became clear. By lunch recess, the dynamics in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. What had begun as Delacroix's confident presentation of a routine tenant dispute had become a judicial investigation into systematic housing fraud. Judge Caprio had transformed from a neutral arbitrator into a determined advocate for justice, using his deep knowledge of both law and human nature to uncover truths that expensive legal teams had hoped to keep buried. As court recessed for lunch, Sarah Martinez watched Delacroix and Blackwood huddle in urgent conversation outside the courtroom. For the first time in 18 months, she felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. Judge Caprio hadn't just listened to her story. He had understood it, investigated it, and was clearly preparing to act on it. The afternoon session would determine not just her family's future, but potentially the fate of countless other families who had been victimized by Delacroix's predatory empire. The afternoon session of Judge Frank Caprio's court began with an electricity in the air that seemed to charge every molecule in the room. Word had spread during the lunch recess that something extraordinary was happening in courtroom 2A, that the beloved judge known throughout Rhode Island for his compassion was about to deliver one of his most significant rulings in decades. The gallery, which had been half empty that morning, was now packed with courthouse staff, local attorneys, and community members who had somehow heard that justice was about to be served in a way that only Frank Caprio could deliver it. Sarah Martinez returned to her seat in the back row, but she no longer felt like the desperate, overwhelmed woman who had sat there that morning. During the lunch break, she had been approached by 3 other former tenants of Marcus Delacroix, who had driven to the courthouse after hearing about the case. Mrs. Chen, the elderly immigrant who had been charged thousands in fake maintenance, Uffiz sat beside her, holding Sarah's hand in silent solidarity. James Wilson, the disabled veteran, had positioned his wheelchair in the aisle, his presence a powerful reminder of the human cost of Delacroix's greed. And Maria Rodriguez, whose family had been evicted after refusing to pay for illegitimate repairs, stood against the back wall, her eyes bright with the possibility of vindication. These weren't just spectators, they were witnesses to a pattern of abuse that Judge Caprio was determined to address comprehensively. During the lunch break, the judge had made several phone calls to the Rhode Island Attorney General's office, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and the Providence Building Inspector. What he had learned had only strengthened his resolve to ensure that this case would mark the end of Delacroix's predatory practices. Marcus Delacroix returned from lunch looking considerably less confident than he had that morning. His expensive suit seemed to hang differently on his shoulders, and his usually perfect composure showed cracks that his attorney, Richard Blackwood, was clearly struggling to patch. During their hurried lunch conference, Blackwood had advised his client that Judge Caprio's questioning had revealed a dangerous level of judicial scrutiny that far exceeded a typical tenant dispute. They were no longer dealing with a routine legal matter. They were facing a judge who had uncovered systemic fraud and was prepared to act on it. But Delacroix, accustomed to intimidating his way out of problems, had made a crucial miscalculation. He believed that his wealth, his legal representation, and his polished presentation would ultimately prevail over what he saw as the sob story of a struggling single mother. He failed to understand that Judge Frank Caprio had built his legendary reputation precisely by seeing through such facades and protecting people exactly like Sarah Martinez from people exactly like him. As Judge Caprio took the bench, his demeanor had subtly but significantly changed from the morning session. While he maintained his characteristic warmth and dignity, there was now an unmistakable sense of purpose in his movements, a focused intensity that those who knew him best recognized as the precursor to one of his most powerful rulings. He had spent his lunch hour not just reviewing legal precedents, but also looking at photographs, pictures of Sarah's children living in dangerous conditions, images of Mrs. Chen's apartment with its fabricated maintenance issues, and documentation of James Wilson's accessibility modifications that he had been illegally forced to fund himself. The judge began the afternoon session by calling Sarah Martinez to the stand, but his approach was markedly different from a typical cross-examination. Instead of challenging her testimony, Judge Caprio created a space for her to tell her complete story, not just the facts of her case, but the human impact of Delacroix's systematic exploitation. His questions were gentle but thorough, designed to illuminate not just what had happened, but how it had affected her family's daily life, her children's well-being, and her faith in the possibility of justice. Sarah's testimony, delivered in clear, steady tones despite the emotion behind her words, painted a devastating picture of deliberate exploitation. She described working triple shifts at the hospital to pay for repairs that should have been the landlord's responsibility, coming home to find her children doing homework by flashlight during one of the many electrical failures, and the humiliation of having to choose between paying Delacroix's illegitimate fees and buying groceries for her family. But it was Sarah's description of her children's reaction to their living conditions that seemed to affect Judge Caprio most deeply. She testified about 8-year-old Isabella asking why their apartment was always so cold when their friends' homes were warm, and 12-year-old Miguel trying to fix electrical problems himself because he didn't want to see his mother cry over another repair bill. These weren't abstract legal issues. They were real children whose childhoods had been damaged by an adult's greed. Judge Caprio's questions revealed his masterful understanding of both law and human psychology. He didn't just ask about the financial Impact of Delacroix's scheme, he explored how the constant stress had affected Sarah's health, her relationship with her children, and her ability to plan for their future. He demonstrated how Delacroix's exploitation extended far beyond illegal fees into a form of psychological warfare that kept tenants trapped in cycles of desperation and dependency. When Judge Caprio called Marcus Delacroix back to the stand, the atmosphere in the courtroom became electric with anticipation. The judge's questions were no longer exploratory. They were prosecutorial in their precision and intensity. Armed with evidence gathered during his lunch-hour investigation, Judge Caprio began systematically dismantling Delacroix's defense with facts that the landlord couldn't dispute or explain away. The judge produced building inspection records showing that Harbor Properties had received 47 code violations over the past 5 years, violations that tenants had unknowingly paid to correct through inflated repair bills. He presented financial records demonstrating that Delacroix's properties generated 180% more revenue per square foot than comparable rentals in Providence, with the excess coming entirely from exploitative fees and charges. Most damaging of all, he revealed communications between Delacroix and his repair team, discussing how to maximize revenue from tenant emergencies. Each piece of evidence was presented with Judge Caprio's characteristic blend of gentle authority and unwavering moral clarity. He didn't raise his voice or use inflammatory language, but his questions carried the weight of absolute judicial authority combined with deep human compassion. The contrast between his quiet dignity and Delacroix's increasingly desperate attempts at justification created a powerful visual representation of justice confronting greed. As the evidence mounted, Delacroix's testimony became increasingly incoherent. He contradicted his earlier statements, claimed ignorance of obvious facts, and finally resorted to blaming his tenants for their own exploitation. This final strategy proved to be his downfall, as it revealed the callous mindset that had enabled years of predatory behavior. Judge Caprio's response to these blame-shifting attempts demonstrated why he had become a beloved figure throughout Rhode Island and beyond. With infinite patience but unwavering firmness, he explained how landlord-tenant law was specifically designed to protect vulnerable renters from exactly the kind of exploitation that Delacroix had practiced. He described how housing is a basic, human need, not a luxury service, and how those who profit from providing shelter have corresponding moral and legal obligations to their tenants. The judge's legal analysis was masterful in its comprehensiveness. He addressed each of Delacroix's contract arguments with precise citations of Rhode Island housing law, demonstrated how the landlord's practices violated both state and federal consumer protection statutes, and explained how the pattern of abuse constituted fraud under both civil and criminal definitions. But more importantly, he connected these legal principles to their human consequences, showing how abstract laws existed to protect real families from real harm. As Judge Caprio's examination continued, it became clear that he was building toward something far more significant than a simple ruling in Sarah Martinez's favor. He was creating a legal record that would serve as the foundation for broader action against Delacroix's entire operation, while simultaneously establishing precedents that would protect future tenants from similar exploitation. The turning point came when Judge Caprio asked Delacroix directly whether he believed his business practices were morally justifiable regardless of their technical legality. The question hung in the air for a long moment as Delacroix struggled to find an answer that wouldn't further incriminate him. His eventual response, a defensive claim that he was simply running a business according to market principles, revealed everything Judge Caprio needed to know about the man's character and intentions. With quiet dignity, Judge Caprio explained, That while America certainly embraced free market principles, those principles had never included the right to exploit vulnerable people's basic needs for shelter and safety. He described how successful businesses in a moral society created value for all parties, while predatory schemes like Delacroix's extracted wealth from those least able to afford the loss while providing no genuine value in return. As the afternoon session drew toward its close, everyone in the courtroom could sense that Judge Caprio was preparing to deliver not just a verdict, but a statement about justice, compassion, and the responsibility that those with power have toward those without it. The gallery sat in absolute silence, understanding that they were about to witness something special, one of those rare moments when the legal system's highest ideals would be perfectly embodied by a judge whose entire career had been dedicated to serving those ideals. Sarah Martinez sat with tears streaming down her face, not from sadness, but from relief and gratitude. For the first time in 18 months, she felt that someone with the power to help her had not only listened to her story, but understood its broader implications. Whatever Judge Caprio decided, she knew that her fight had not been in vain, that her courage in standing up to Delacroix would help protect other families from similar exploitation. Judge Frank Caprio rose from the bench as the final afternoon. Light filtered through the tall windows of Providence Municipal Court. The golden October sunshine seemed to illuminate not just the courtroom, but the profound moment of justice that was about to unfold. In his 78 years, Judge Caprio had delivered thousands of rulings, but few had carried the moral weight and human significance of the decision he was about to render. The courtroom had fallen into a reverent silence. Even the usual sounds of shuffling papers and whispered conversations had ceased as everyone present understood they were about to witness something extraordinary. Sarah Martinez sat in the front row now, no longer relegated to the back corner where she had spent the morning feeling invisible and overwhelmed. Beside her sat the other victims of Marcus Delacroix's predatory scheme, their presence a powerful testament to the broader implications of this case. Judge Caprio looked out over the assembled crowd with eyes that reflected both the wisdom of decades on the bench and the compassion that had made him beloved throughout Rhode Island and beyond. When he spoke, his voice carried the gentle authority that had become his trademark, firm enough to command absolute attention, yet warm enough to convey his deep empathy for human suffering. In my many years serving the people of Rhode Island, from this bench, Judge Caprio began, I have seen the best and worst of human nature. I have witnessed extraordinary acts of kindness, forgiveness, and redemption. I have also confronted deliberate cruelty, calculated greed, and the exploitation of those who can least defend themselves. Today's case represents one of the most systematic and heartless examples of such exploitation that has ever come before this court. The judge's opening words established the gravity of what was to follow. This would not be a routine ruling on a landlord-tenant dispute, but a comprehensive judgment that addressed both the specific harm done to Sarah Martinez and the broader pattern of abuse that had victimized countless other families. Ms. Martinez, Judge Caprio continued, turning his attention to Sarah with a gentle smile that conveyed both respect and paternal concern. I want you to know that your courage in bringing this case forward has illuminated injustices that might otherwise have remained hidden. Your willingness to fight back, despite the enormous personal cost, has created an opportunity to protect other families from the exploitation you have suffered. Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes as she heard these words. For 18 months, she had been made to feel that her struggles were her own fault, that her inability to keep up with Delacroix's escalating demands represented personal failure rather than systematic abuse. Judge Caprio's recognition of her courage validated not just her legal claims, but her worth as a human being deserving of dignity and respect. The judge then turned his attention to Marcus Delacroix, who sat rigidly beside his attorney, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Mr. Delacroix," Judge Caprio said, his tone remaining gentle but carrying unmistakable authority, "your testimony today has revealed a business model that systematically targets the most vulnerable members of our community. You have turned housing, a basic human need, into a tool for exploitation." Judge Caprio's analysis of Delacroix's scheme was both legally precise and morally clear. He detailed how the landlord had deliberately targeted single mothers, elderly immigrants, disabled veterans, and other vulnerable populations, not because they were difficult tenants, but because their circumstances made them ideal victims for financial exploitation. The judge explained how Delacroix had created artificial emergencies, charged illegal fees, and maintained dangerous conditions, all while presenting himself as a helpful, understanding property manager. "The evidence presented in this case," Judge Caprio continued, "demonstrates that over the past decade, Harbor Properties LLC has extracted approximately $400,000 in illegitimate fees from tenants who believed they had no choice but to pay. This represents not just contract violations or civil infractions, but systematic fraud that has caused immeasurable harm to families throughout our community." The judge's ruling began with immediate relief for Sarah Martinez. He ordered Marcus Delacroix to refund every illegitimate fee, charge, and payment that Sarah had been forced to make, a total of $18,500 that represented the difference between what she had actually paid and what she should have paid under a legitimate lease agreement. But more importantly, he ordered Delacroix to immediately bring Sarah's apartment up to full compliance with all housing and safety codes at his own expense, ensuring that her children would finally have the safe, warm home they deserved. However, Judge Caprio's ruling extended far beyond Sarah's individual case. Drawing on his authority as a municipal judge and his responsibility to protect public welfare, he issued comprehensive orders that would reshape Delacroix's entire business operation. Harbor Properties was placed under immediate court supervision, with all rent increases, fees, and repair charges subject to judicial review. The company was ordered to submit to quarterly inspections by licensed housing authorities, with all violations to be corrected at Delacroix's expense within 30 days of identification. Most significantly, Judge Caprio ordered the creation of a victim compensation fund financed entirely by Delacroix's personal assets. Every tenant who had been exploited by Harbor Properties' predatory practices over the past 10 years would be eligible for full restitution, plus additional compensation for the stress, inconvenience, and harm they had suffered. The judge appointed a special master to oversee this process, ensuring that victims would receive justice even if they couldn't afford attorneys or didn't fully understand their rights. But Judge Caprio's most powerful statement came in his explanation of the broader principles behind his ruling. "In America," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent defending these ideals, "we believe in free enterprise and individual responsibility. But we also believe that those principles must be balanced with basic human decency and respect for the dignity of every person. When business becomes predatory, when profit is pursued through the systematic exploitation of vulnerability, then it is not just bad business. It is a betrayal of the values that make our society worth preserving." The judge's words resonated throughout the crowded courtroom as he explained how housing represents more than a commercial transaction. A home is where children do homework, where families gather for dinner, where people find safety and rest after long days of work. When landlords like Mr. Delacroix turn housing into a weapon of exploitation, They don't just steal money, they steal security, dignity, and hope from families who are already struggling to build better lives. Judge Caprio's ruling also addressed the systemic nature of the problem that Sarah's case had revealed. He ordered Harbour Properties to implement tenant education programs, ensuring that all current and future renters would understand their rights and know how to report violations. The company was required to post clear notices in multiple languages explaining tenant protections and to provide contact information for legal aid organizations that could assist renters who faced exploitation. The judge also took the extraordinary step of referring the case to state and federal authorities for potential criminal prosecution. His ruling included a detailed legal analysis demonstrating how Delacroix's systematic targeting of vulnerable populations, use of deceptive practices, and creation of artificial emergencies constituted fraud under both Rhode Island state law and federal consumer protection statutes. Justice, Judge Caprio explained as he neared the conclusion of his ruling, is not simply about punishment or even compensation. True justice requires that we address the root causes of harm and create systems that prevent future victimization. This case has revealed gaps in our housing protection system that have allowed predatory landlords to operate with impunity for far too long. As part of his comprehensive remedy, Judge Caprio ordered the creation of a new monitoring system for rental properties in Providence. Landlords with histories of code violations or tenant complaints would be subject to enhanced scrutiny, including mandatory participation in ethical property management training programs. The system would also provide better resources for tenants to report problems and seek assistance before exploitation could escalate to the level that Sarah Martinez had experienced. The judge's attention to detail in crafting his remedy demonstrated his deep understanding of both law and human nature. He recognized that financial compensation alone would not undo the trauma that Delacroix's victims had experienced, nor would it prevent future predatory landlords from following similar schemes. His ruling therefore included provisions for counseling services for affected families, assistance with finding alternative housing for those who chose to relocate, and ongoing monitoring to ensure that all court orders were fully implemented. Marcus Delacroix sat motionless as Judge Caprio delivered these comprehensive orders, the reality of his situation finally penetrating his consciousness. His predatory empire, built over a decade of systematic exploitation, was being dismantled completely and permanently. More than that, he was facing personal financial ruin as the Victim Compensation Fund would require him to liquidate substantial personal assets to pay for the harm he had caused. But perhaps most devastating to Delacroix was Judge Caprio's final, personal admonition. "Mr. Delacroix," the judge said, his voice carrying profound disappointment rather than anger, "you have been blessed with resources, education, and opportunities that many people in our community lack. You could have used those advantages to provide quality housing and honest service to families who needed both. Instead, you chose to exploit their vulnerabilities and profit from their desperation. That choice reveals a poverty of character that no amount of wealth can remedy." Judge Caprio's words carried particular power because they came not from a position of self-righteousness, but from genuine sadness about wasted potential and unnecessary suffering. The judge had spent his career believing in human redemption and second chances, but Delacroix's systematic, decade-long exploitation of vulnerable families had demonstrated a level of calculated callousness that challenged even Judge Caprio's famous optimism about human nature. As the judge concluded his ruling, he turned his attention back to Sarah Martinez and the other victims present in the courtroom. To Ms. Martinez, Mrs. Chen, Mr. Wilson, Ms. Rodriguez, and all the other families who have suffered under this exploitation, I want you to know that your voices have been heard, your pain has been acknowledged, and your courage in speaking truth to power will protect countless other families from similar harm. The emotional impact of these words was immediate and powerful. Sarah Martinez, who had spent 18 months feeling isolated and overwhelmed by forces beyond her control, found herself surrounded by a community of support that included not just fellow victims, but court officials, attorneys, and community members who had been moved by her story and inspired by her courage. Judge Caprio's final remarks addressed the broader community that had gathered to witness this extraordinary moment of justice. This case reminds us that our society's strength is measured not by the wealth of our most successful members, but by how we treat our most vulnerable. When we allow exploitation to flourish unchecked, we diminish ourselves collectively. When we stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves, we fulfill our highest aspirations as a community. As Judge Caprio concluded his ruling and prepared to adjourn the court, spontaneous applause began in the gallery. Something highly unusual in a formal courtroom setting, but entirely appropriate given the extraordinary nature of what had just occurred. The applause was not celebratory in a triumphant sense, but rather represented a collective expression of gratitude for witnessing justice delivered with both power and compassion. Sarah Martinez stood to thank Judge Caprio, but found herself unable to speak through her tears of relief and gratitude. The judge smiled warmly and gestured for her to approach the bench, where he spoke to her quietly for several minutes, offering not just legal advice about the implementation of his orders, but paternal encouragement about rebuilding her life and continuing to advocate for others who faced similar struggles. In the weeks that followed Judge Caprio's ruling, the case's impact extended far beyond the Providence Municipal Court. News outlets throughout Rhode Island and New England covered the story as an example of judicial courage and compassion in action. More importantly, the ruling inspired other victims of predatory landlords to come forward, leading to a broader investigation into housing exploitation throughout the region. The Victim Compensation Fund that Judge Caprio had ordered eventually distributed over $600,000 to families who had been exploited by harbor properties, money that allowed parents to provide better lives for their children, elderly residents to afford necessary medical care, and disabled veterans to secure appropriate housing accommodations. Many recipients used their compensation to move to better housing, while others chose to stay in improved properties under the court's monitoring system. Marcus Delacroix's business empire collapsed completely within 6 months of Judge Caprio's ruling. Unable to maintain his properties without exploitative revenue streams, he was forced to sell most of his real estate holdings to comply with the court's compensation orders. More significantly, his case became a teaching example in law schools and property management programs throughout New England, serving as a cautionary tale about the legal and moral consequences of predatory business practices. But perhaps the most important legacy of the case was its demonstration of how individual courage, combined with judicial wisdom and community support, could triumph over systematic exploitation. Sarah Martinez became an advocate for tenant rights, working with legal aid organizations to help other families recognize and resist predatory housing practices. Her children, Miguel and Isabella, grew up with an understanding that justice, while sometimes slow, could ultimately prevail when people were willing to fight for what was right. Judge Frank Caprio's handling of the case added another chapter to his legendary reputation as a jurist who combined legal expertise with deep human compassion. His ruling demonstrated that the law, when applied with wisdom and courage, could be a powerful tool for protecting the vulnerable and holding the powerful accountable. More than that, it showed how one person's commitment to justice could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. As Sarah Martinez tucked her children into bed that night in their newly safe and warm apartment, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that desperate morning when she had first walked into Judge Caprio's courtroom. She had entered as a victim, overwhelmed by forces beyond her control. She left as a survivor, empowered by the knowledge that her voice mattered, and her courage had made a difference not just for her own family, but for countless others who would benefit from the precedent that Judge Caprio's ruling had established. The case of Martinez versus Delacroix became more than a legal victory. It became a testament to the enduring power of justice when it is combined with compassion, wisdom, and the unwavering belief that every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. In Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom, those principles weren't just legal abstractions, they were living values that transformed lives and strengthened communities, one case at a time. Thanks for watching. We'd love to know where you're watching from. Tell us in the comments below if this story touched your heart. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe so you never miss the next case. Your support helps us share more powerful stories of justice and compassion.